There's never really an ideal location to go to war. Every terrain, every biome, every climate has its own unique challenges, which can be just as much a danger to the soldiers there as their enemy combatants. From the incredible heat and dryness of the desert to the freezing cold and resource scarcity of the Arctic, the terrible mud and trenches of open plains, or the innumerable human perils of the city, every place on Earth contains perils of many different designs. But even in wars, where every environment can be used as a weapon, where any place not already inhospitable can be very quickly made inhospitable by the enemy, nowhere sucks more than the jungle. On today's installment of our Art of War series, we're going to be taking a closer look at jungle warfare, the tools and tactics that could keep a soldier alive, the many jungle conflicts that have played out throughout history, and the fundamental question of how any warrior can hope to survive there, and not just survive, but win. Now, when discussing the idea of jungle warfare, there's one critical point that sets it apart from all other concepts of terrain-based warfighting. The jungle is not a passive participant in combat. What is it, heat, or thin air at high altitude, or a city's subterranean sewers and train tunnels all come with their fair share of peril? A human being trying to survive there can at least take comfort in the knowledge that they're not actively being hunted. Bring in the right gear, take the right precautions, and invest time and energy into all the right training, and even though those environments might still be challenging, they'll eventually feel like a place where a soldier can survive or even thrive. But the jungle, and the jungle alone, plays on offense. Blanketing about 12% of the Earth's surface, predominantly in equatorial regions like Central and South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia, the world's tropical forests are some of the most biodiverse, vibrant, and fundamentally alive places on Earth. But life in all places is embroiled in a long war of survival. And in the jungles, where some 500 metric tons of biomass or more can be crammed into a single hectare, you can bet that any human who steps foot inside is going to immediately become a part of that battle too. In the case of jungle warfare, we simply cannot enter a discussion of tactics or strategy without first cataloguing the threats a person will face in jungle territory, and that list of threats is super long. Now we'll start with climate, which in some small consolation doesn't tend to be lethal on its own. As many viewers certainly know for themselves, extreme humidity is not a pleasant experience, and it can make even mundane tasks pretty darn miserable. Add that humidity to the rigorous demands of navigating a jungle and fighting an armed adversary, and life deep in the rainforest can get pretty damn nasty. Heavy rainfall can make for an even more unpleasant time, and chilly nights plus wet clothing can certainly raise the risk of hypothermia, but these are all issues that can be accommodated relatively easily. What's not so easy is dealing with the rainforest's other inhabitants. Survival in jungle warfare begins and ends with a person's ability to escape malaria, a widespread tropical disease that can cause vomiting, diarrhea, anemia, and if infection progresses far enough, organ failure. It's debilitating for multiple weeks at a time and makes movement all but impossible, which is a bit of a rough combination for military units that have got to stay light and mobile in order to survive. And unfortunately, malaria is everywhere in most tropical jungles, courtesy of that most ubiquitous insect of all, the mosquito. As such, every jungle warfare unit has got to be on constant alert for the little things, staying attentive to every scratch and sting, accounting for powerful insect repellent in their packing, and actively avoiding mosquito-ridden areas like pockets of still water, which crop up unpredictably but very frequently during the wet seasons. Soldiers must always factor in the ability to hang mosquito nets where they set up camp, the ability to lay low at dawn and dusk when the bugs are most active, and the strong likelihood that at least a couple of people in their unit are going to deal with severe illness while on the move. And then there's all the other invertebrates who regard soldiers as either a threat or perhaps a meal. In many of the world's jungles, centipedes and scorpions are common and can have stings that are exceptionally painful and indeed sometimes fatal. So too can the jungle host some truly ridiculous spiders, many of whom are more than happy to explore the bodies, extremities, and even faces of soldiers while they sleep. And to those who decided that that particular sentence was when they'd click off this video, we don't blame you. Perhaps the most dangerous of all, other than mosquitoes, are the ants, who will be harmless or only bite occasionally if soldiers can stay on the move, but who will quickly identify any soldier unlucky enough to be wounded and rendered immobile. Then those soldiers very quickly become food for swarms of ants that will operate as armies of their own, cutting off and carting away bits of flesh from a victim who could still be conscious to witness the whole thing. And then there's the leeches, blood-sucking worms whose bites cause ulcers and infection, and who are all but guaranteed to be omnipresent in streams, swamps, ponds, and any other body of water that a soldier must have to traverse. And look, if all of that isn't nasty enough already, let's move on to the vertebrates, and specifically, let's start with the snakes. And another point, people are like, I'm out, Simon. No more of this video for me. I wanted war, not jungles. From rattlesnakes, to the fertile ants, to the mamba, the bush viper, and the forest cobra, jungle vipers are not something to mess around with, and their venom can do anything from making you moderately sick for a few days to literally melting your organs from the inside out. So that's lovely. They're also very, very good at hiding, meaning they'll probably see you coming long before you see them. And if they're attacking that person at all, it's almost always in a situation where the snake perceives itself to be threatened. Like any other animal backed into a corner, that means that a venomous snake is going to try and be as lethal as it possibly can. And they can be lethal, really, really lethal. But beyond the snakes, soldiers trying to traverse wetlands or survive battle in a swampy area will need to be on the lookout for crocodiles and caimans in Asia and the Americas. In Latin America, they'll need to be on the lookout for jaguars, while in Africa and Asia, it's leopards and tigers that will take advantage of a wounded or helpless soldier in order to get a quick meal. Perhaps more dangerous than any of the big cats, though, is the hippopotamus. It's aggressive, it's territorial, it's big enough to attack small vehicles and boats, and they are deadly at the best of times, let alone when they might be startled or fearful of the cacophony of a nearby firefight. But look, we're still not done, because it's not just the animals that are trying to kill someone in the jungle, it's the plants too, from tree nettles with a debilitating skin to oily plants that can cause rashes or even burns to thick thorny bushes that'll ensnare any fleshy extremity that's offered to them. Diseases are common, from dysentery to cholera to typhoid fever spread by contaminated water, and then there's the parasites, the worms, the fungi, which can quickly take over the body of any person who doesn't keep themselves as clean and hygienic as possible. Are people still really watching this? It is skin-crawling stuff. Even the most appetizing fruits and nuts can be lethal if not properly identified, and again, even the ones that aren't lethal can be so debilitating that a soldier cannot keep up with the movements of their unit. With so many other forms of life to worry about, all more than happy to harm a human they perceive as a threat or a meal, our earlier statement that the jungle plays on offense rather than defense should make a good deal more sense. Although dangerous flora and fauna exist in many corners of the world, the threat they pose in the jungle is orders of magnitude larger than the threat they pose everywhere else, like your garden. And just as devastating as the actual effects of disease or venom is the constant fear a soldier will have to endure if they aren't properly trained and prepared to deal with every element of the jungle environment. In a place where sleeping means giving oneself over to a swarm of insects and spiders, or where getting too desperate for water means almost guaranteeing oneself a bout of cholera, it's all too easy to lose focus or become exhausted. And when exhaustion takes over, everything, be it a living being or a feature of the terrain, immediately becomes far more deadly than it otherwise would have been. And then we get to the non-living obstacles to survival. In the thick jungle, covered in heavy overgrowth, it's easy to be disorientated without the aid of a compass and map. And even on a good day, it can be very difficult to move through vegetation on the jungle floor, with heavy vines closing in from every direction. Any movement in such an environment is a slow, grinding affair, using machetes and hand knives to clear narrow tunnels that'll be overgrown again the following day. It's so slow, in fact, that traveling just a kilometer's distance can take multiple hours. But as inefficient as it is, this sort of travel is also the safest option for a military unit. Try to stick to the higher ridges or cliffsides where the growth might not be so thick, and you'll be far more visible to the enemy, with almost no ability to see the enemy staring back at you amidst the trees. And it should be obvious by now that a whole lot of equipment that a military usually relies on is not going to be available in the deep jungle. In terrain that's so difficult for people to navigate on foot, it's all but impossible to clear a path for even a single-rider ATV, let alone a jeep or even a tank. Even if that could be done, such a prolonged, noisy operation in a single spot would be an unmissable signal to a nearby enemy. You're essentially saying, here we are, come and ambush us. So too, is it all but impossible to move large units of troops on foot, or coordinate logistical resupply on the ground, or provide close air support with any more precision than an indiscriminate bombing run. Snipers often can't find their line of sight, and there's no hope of building large, stable bridges or useful airstrips unless the area can first be cleared of enemy forces, locked down, and supplied for long enough that large-scale support can eventually arrive. Until that happens, the small units sent to penetrate the heavy jungle are going to be functionally on their own. Add to all that the simple fact that a jungle is a vast overgeneralization of the actual conditions that a person might face. A lowland tropical rainforest, perhaps in a river valley or a great watershed like the Amazon, is fundamentally different than the hilly, mountainous or volcanic jungle islands that you might find along the Pacific Rim. Some jungles can be found along coasts, blanketed in the entangled roots of the mangrove tree, while others might be covered in fast-growing vines, and still others might be made up not of trees, but of bamboo. Some have cultivated clearings used for agriculture or to host small towns, thus demanding that troops in the jungle be ready to face not just the perils of the rainforest, but minefields, enemy bases, and urban fighting as well. And still others may host uncontacted groups of people utterly unaware that there's a war being fought on their doorstep and only concerned with the threat a soldier might pose to their own way of life. Now, it's not to say that the jungle doesn't have its advantages. In such heavy tree cover, it pays to be the side that knows the area better, to have known routes of travel across the landscape. With the density of vegetation in these areas, it's possible to be so well camouflaged that the enemy wouldn't even know if they stepped on you, and it's easy to prepare booby traps and ambushes while keeping one's own camps concealed. This is a lesson that guerrilla fighters and other forces who can make up for lesser numbers or equipment by relying on the jungle will know implicitly, and it's a lesson that conventional forces can learn as well. No amount of training or careful coordination can ever make the jungle a true ally. It is a neutral actor in any war, and it's equally eager to punish the combatants of every side. But a military unit that can use its troops and capabilities to augment the pain that the jungle inflicts on its enemy can be all the more effective in a protracted campaign. A history of jungle warfare usually begins in the year 9 CE with the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest between ancient Roman legionaries and an alliance of Germanic tribes inhabiting the forest and its surrounding area. In this battle, somewhere between 15 and 23,000 Romans under the command of General Publius Varus went up against a roughly equivalent number of Germanic warriors under the Cheruscian chieftain Arminius. But even though the numbers were somewhat equal, the Germanic tribes had the forest on their side, and they took full advantage of it by laying in wait with a large ambush. With the Romans stretched out into a line, marching somewhere over 15 kilometers long, they were sitting ducks for attacks by javelin, cavalry charge, and overwhelming infantry attacks at concentrated points. Lost in the forest, disorientated, and surrounded by an enemy who knew their surroundings far better than the Romans did, Rome was utterly incapable of defending itself against the onslaught. The vast majority of Roman soldiers present at the battle are believed to have been killed, while the Germanic tribes suffered only minor losses. Although it's not the sort of tropical rainforest we've discussed thus far, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest is among the earliest examples of a military force allying itself with the wilderness to defeat its enemy. A similar situation went down some 17 centuries later during the 7 Years' War in the vast wilderness of mid-1700s North America. In this war, French troops formed alliances with powerful Native American tribes in the area in order to repel a British advance. With similar tactics to the Germanic tribes of a millennium before, French and native forces attacked from well-camouflaged positions in the forest, continually harassing British advancing columns who were unable to see the individual warriors running circles around them. The defeat Britain sustained was enough to force a tactical change. From that point forward, the British waged their half of the 7 Years' War using a combination of irregular colonial troops who were used to life on the frontiers and experienced German hunters who were trained in scout tactics. The colonial troops in particular would make good of their wilderness training a few decades later, with their muskets turned against unprepared British troops in the American Revolutionary War. Sticking with Britain for a moment though, and heading this time to a proper tropical rainforest, we find Britain's offensives in the West Indies. Hungry for the economic benefits of control over sugar production, the British of the time were utterly unprepared for the tropical diseases of the region, most prominently yellow fever. So severe were the effects of the disease that a posting to fight in or hold parts of the West Indies was widely regarded as a death sentence by British soldiers. When the French Revolution prompted slave revolts in British areas, the British were forced to deal with insurgent-style attacks by former slaves living safely in the jungle interior while attacking outward to expose British positions. Between the effects of disease and guerrilla attacks, Britain was forced to resolve the situation simply by throwing healthy young men at the West Indies, allowing them to fight for a bit before they succumbed, and throwing more men in after them. And we'll carry on with the UK for one more entry, moving to the Third Anglo-Ashanti War in what was then the British Gold Coast. Britain had just acquired this particular stretch of territory from the Dutch about a year prior, and quickly had it invaded by the neighbouring Ashanti Empire in modern-day Ghana. In response to the invasion, thousands of British troops were sent alongside native regiments to attack inland against the Ashanti, but they had significant trouble repelling constant flanking attacks that used the local jungle to the Ashanti's advantage. Britain was forced to spend valuable time cutting through impenetrable thickets and vines in the bush, still weathering attacks and contending with disease and the formidable Ghanaian wet season. And then there's the United States, which got its first introduction to jungle warfare during the Spanish-American War of the late 1890s. In the war's first land engagement near Santiago de Cuba on the island of Cuba, Americans and Cubans went head-to-head with Spanish forces in and around the jungle. Although the Americans were unprepared for such an engagement, the Cubans were used to the dense forest and could navigate the traps and wire fences that the Spanish had laid down. Americans in the Philippines, aiding the freedom-fighting insurrectos, got a similar crash course on the hostile conditions, and by the end of the conflict, multiple American units had gained fighting fluency in the jungle. In World War I, combat was mostly constrained to short skirmishes in German-held jungle islands in the Far East, but the German resistance to an invasion of the German Cameroons was the exception to the rule. Holding out with some 3,000 German troops and over 20,000 Africans, the Germans were able to withstand numerous Allied assaults, with the conflict eventually descending into mutual jungle warfare on both sides. The eventual Allied victory was largely a factor of their ability to bring in more and more troops to get the better of the attritional small unit jungle fighting, plus their ability to use Ford motor lorries to establish forward operating bases. But no conversation on jungle warfare is complete without discussing Imperial Japan and the island-hopping campaigns of the Second World War. In these battles, fought on mountainous jungle islands in the Philippines, New Guinea and elsewhere, Allied, British and American troops found themselves trapped in a special sort of hell, one where the most devastating tropical diseases, the most terrifying flora and fauna, and the most miserable weather conditions imaginable were combined with an asymmetrical, well-armed army that was vastly better equipped for jungle warfare. Sources from early in the war tell of relentless Japanese attacks, coming in bad weather, at dawn, at dusk, and in the dead of the night. Disciplined and lethal, the Japanese were expert at close-range attacks, killing with knives or their bare hands rather than guns, and leaving behind the mutilated bodies of Allied soldiers for their friends to discover in the morning. Combine that with constant ambush attacks and an emphasis on high mobility, and the Japanese were able to create massive combat success and instill a culture of fear and exhaustion in Allied forces that took years to overcome. Of course, Allied forces were capable of learning too, and before too long, individual Allied units had gained their own fluency in jungle warfare. For example, British officers under the command of Freddie Spencer Chapman were able to lead prolonged resistance in the Malaysian jungle, relying on guerrilla forces made up of ethnic Chinese communists. Australia would have its own jungle warfare units, including Z Special Unit, a team that conducted sabotage and reconnaissance attacks all across the Southwest Pacific. And US forces gained valuable experience from their partnerships with catching guerrillas, while in Burma, Merrill's Marauders learnt many of the critical jungle warfare lessons that would inspire their successors, the US Army Rangers. After the war's end, Portugal was the European power most thoroughly embroiled in jungle warfare, dealing with separate insurgencies and independence movements in Angola, Guinea, and Mozambique in the collectively titled Portuguese Colonial War. In these offensives, Portugal attempted to get around the local insurgencies' aptitude in jungle fighting by deploying their own elite troops, paratroopers, marines, commandos, and more, who could operate fluently as mobile units and dart around the battlefield in all directions to deal with insurgent attacks. But eventually, war on so many fronts proved impossible for Portugal to continue, and all three territories eventually won their independence. In our last historical example, we're going to stop off in Vietnam, where American GIs spent over a decade waging a counterinsurgent war against North Vietnamese irregular troops. This conflict saw the rise of the American Special Forces, Army Rangers, combat trackers, and long-range reconnaissance patrols, all in response to active combat in the jungle, to the point where the United States really did achieve tactical mastery of a jungle environment to do battle. However, it was because of the US military's failure to organize strategic success to back up its tactical success that the Vietnam War ultimately resulted in the American withdrawal, despite the US winning nearly every major battle. Their primary enemies in the jungle, the Viet Cong insurgents, were excellent at fusing modern weaponry with the tried and true principles of jungle warfare, making use of both spike pits and other traps, and RPGs, machine guns, and other modern weapons of war in a campaign that made ambush and sabotage its primary weapons. All right, so let's move into some modern-day cases of jungle warfare, and let's first travel to Colombia, to an insurgency that's been going on for the better part of 5 decades. Sheltered in the jungles and high mountains of the Colombian wilderness, the leftist Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, have waged a war of insurgency against the Colombian government that's turned into an endless cat-and-mouse battle. Although hostilities in Colombia have mostly died down in recent years, the preceding decades have seen FARC troops engage Colombia in an endless string of small skirmishes, hit-and-run attacks, and sabotage, relying on mobile companies and not attempting to mount a defense of any territory that they might hold. In an area thrashed by tropical storms and blanketed in rainforest, FARC are among the world's most dangerous jungle rebels, a distinction they'll probably continue to hold long after their formal resistance to Colombian rule ends for good. Moving over to the Philippines, we come to the Siege of Marawi, a 5-month battle in which Philippine security forces slowly eradicated Islamic State militants from the city of Marawi in 2017. Although the bulk of the fighting took place in the city of Marawi and was thus comprised of the grinding urban warfare that we've already covered in a separate video, the collapse of the Islamic State resistance in Marawi pushed those jihadist fighters into the surrounding wilderness, where they've waged a low-grade and mostly unsuccessful insurgency ever since. And in a conflict that almost never gets the attention it deserves, a wide range of factions are currently duking it out in a 2-decade-old conflict in the Central African Republic. In a country that's almost entirely blanketed in thick jungle, the Central African Republic is less a contiguous nation than a patchwork of local militias and warlord-controlled areas. Here, the rainforest has forced the conflict to be waged in a very long, slow, and grinding series of skirmishes where the Russian paramilitary Wagner Group has recently set up shop to protect Russian interests in the country, no doubt picking up their own valuable experience in jungle warfare. As for the worldwide units that prepare their troops for jungle warfare engagements, there's perhaps no better place to start than Brazil. In a country made up almost entirely of the Amazon rainforest, jungle skills are a prerequisite for any successful defense of Brazilian territory. Answering the call for training and troop competency is the SIGS, or in English, the Jungle Training Warfare Center. Many thousands of students from around the world have gone through the program, which emphasizes the ability to use the jungle as an ally and a point of retreat while launching incessant small unit raids and ambushes against a less equipped enemy force. In the Brazilian way of jungle fighting, war can often be unorthodox and unconventional. A common ambush tactic involves dropping logs on enemies' heads, while leaders are often taught to position a few soldiers in the rear of an ambush to silently eliminate fleeing enemies with poison darts. The training, conducted in the state capital city of Manaus, covers living in the jungle, special techniques for warfighting and operational tactics, plus dedicated physical training for the demands of a jungle fight. A similarly elite training program, the Counterinsurgency and Jungle Warfare School, runs out of the town of Aragentia in India. With a long history stemming from conflict with East Pakistan, today known as Bangladesh, the Indian CIJWS is a world leader in jungle warfare preparedness and puts a strong emphasis on tactics needed for counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations in jungle environments. Under India's model, troops aren't learning to outwit guerrilla fighters as much as they're learning to mimic them, living and fighting as a guerrilla force would, but adding modern training and combat sensibilities into the mix. And most major militaries around the world will offer at least some instruction on jungle warfare and survivability. In the United States, for example, the Lightning Academy in Hawaii offers a jungle operations training course, a 12-day program that teaches jungle mobility, water operations, tracking, and survival skills. In Malaysia, Army Rangers learn animal trapping skills and emphasize understanding and sometimes even using the hostile flora and fauna of the jungle in order to turn the fight to their advantage. In Australia, the Royal Infantry Corps has emphasized viewing all jungle warfare as close-quarters combat, emphasizing training smaller team tactics, proper equipment selection, and cognitive preparedness. As one Australian commander put it, quote, "The team that has the ability to rapidly gain the initiative and inflict overwhelming controlled violence will win. But in simpler terms, whichever force in a jungle-based conflict can more quickly and effectively go on offense at a moment's notice will usually be winning the small engagements that make up their time in the rainforest." As time goes on, jungle regions around the world have become less prominent in 21st century warfare, and today any flashpoints in the world's rainforests tend to be relatively minor. But as warfare continues to modernize, the jungle conflicts that do take place might begin to evolve relatively soon. In particular, the addition of cheap reconnaissance drones and quadcopters to a conflict can offer a valuable opportunity to do the one thing that's remained nearly impossible in the deep jungle: to extend one's visibility beyond just a few meters in each direction, to sniff out ambushes, and to find enemy camps by means other than just stumbling into them. And as global powers, particularly Russia, turn to paramilitary units to lock down their holdings in the jungle, there's increased risk that isolated units from the world's major powers will meet there. The sparks that such a confrontation would add to a tinderbox of rising global tensions, we can't really say, but we can encourage our interested observers to keep an eye on the jungles. They aren't where the large-scale wars of the future are likely to be fought, but they very well could be where those wars start.